The last sound humanity made before going silent was not a scream. It was not a prayer, not a plea, not the desperate crackle of a dying distress signal flung into uncaring stars. The last sound humanity made, the final transmission broadcast from the Sol system on the 14th of March 2287, was 3 words, delivered in a voice so calm, it disturbed every xenolinguist who later studied the recording. 3 words. We will remember. Then silence. 100 years of silence. The Keith Dominion had been methodical about it. That was what the other species remembered most. Not the scale of the massacre, not the duration, not even the screaming in those final weeks. What they remembered was how organized it was, how the Keith fleet had arrived in triangulated formation, 17 dreadnoughts and 240 support vessels emerging from fold space at the precise gravitational coordinates that ensured Earth's defensive grid would be blinded by its own magnetosphere for exactly 9 minutes. 9 minutes. That was all the Keith needed. The orbital platforms were gone in the first 3, the deep space listening arrays in the next 4. In the final 2 minutes before Earth's systems could compensate and reorient, the Keth unleashed what their own military historians would later call the quieting pulse, a focused tachyon disruption wave that didn't destroy ships, didn't detonate cities, didn't vaporize oceans. It simply ended communications. Every quantum-entangled relay, every Ansible beacon, every long-range transmitter from Mercury's sun-baked surface to the Kuiper Belt listening posts. Gone. Not destroyed in fire, but quietly, clinically severed. As though a surgeon had cut the vocal cords of a species. The Keth called it mercy. They called it surgical. What followed was not surgical. What followed was the Tyrant Fleet's ground campaign across 17 human colony worlds, Proxima Station, the Eden Clusters, New Carthage, the Kepler Belt settlements, all of them, in a 6-week campaign that the Galactic Historical Commission would later classify under a single, bureaucratic heading, Population Reduction Event, Sol Arm, 2287. 14 billion human beings, gone in 6 weeks. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 11 days after the last confirmed human signal. Ambassador Vreth of the Hegemony of Aligned Worlds stood at the central podium and delivered what historians would later call the most shamefully pragmatic speech in the Council's 4,000-year history. The human species, Vreth said, in that measured, layered voice of the hegemony, has demonstrated that it lacks the resilience required for galactic citizenship. Their silence confirms what we have long suspected, that humanity was an anomaly, a flash of potential that burned too quickly, too brightly, and too briefly. We mourn the loss of 14 billion lives. We also acknowledge that resistance to the Keth Dominion at this juncture would destabilize the Lyran Accord and invite retaliatory campaigns against 8 other species. The vote to formally decline intervention passed 43-1. The one dissenting vote came from a species called the Vylori, a quiet ancient race of deep ocean dwellers from a world called Thessara Minor. The Vylori ambassador, a towering creature of bioluminescent flesh and slow, deliberate movement, cast her vote and then said only this before leaving the chamber. You are all making a catastrophic mistake. No one asked her to clarify. The Keth had expected humanity to collapse, 14 billion dead. Communications severed, fleet destroyed, colonies burning. Every military model in the Dominion's war planning archives pointed to the same projected outcome. Within 18 months, the surviving human population, estimated at roughly 400 million, scattered across remote mining outposts, deep space stations, and the underdeveloped outer colonies, would fragment, turn inward, collapse into feudalism or simple extinction. They had seen it happen to 4 other species. They watched the human systems carefully for the first year, then the second, then the 5th. The silence held. No transmissions, no fleet movements, no diplomatic overtures, no desperate pleas to the Galactic Council. Nothing. By the 20th year of silence, the Keth High Command had downgraded humanity from contained threat to residual population. By the 40th year, humanity barely appeared in their intelligence briefings. By the 60th year, there was a formal proposal within the Keth Senate to redirect the small garrison fleet watching the Sol Arm to more pressing frontier duties. The proposal passed. The garrison was withdrawn. And in the quiet of abandoned space in the dark between stars where no Keth sensor array was watching, something extraordinary was happening. Humanity was not dying. Humanity was building. On a deep space station called Cradle, so far from the Sol system that its coordinates weren't even listed in Keth navigational charts, a woman named Admiral Sarah Voss stood before a wall of light. The wall stretched 30 meters across and 12 high, embedded in the command center of a station that officially did not exist. It was not a screen. It was a map. A living, constantly updated, three-dimensional strategic display of the entire known galaxy. Every star system color-coded, every known Keth installation marked in burning red, every human asset marked in deep, cold blue. There were, by this point, a great many blue markers, more than the Keth would have believed possible, more perhaps than the Galactic Council deserved to know. Admiral Voss was 63 years old. She had been 4 years old when the Keth came. She did not remember Earth from experience. She remembered it from the oral histories her grandmother had recorded on a handheld device in the last weeks before the colony ship left, fleeing through a debris corridor the Keth hadn't bothered to watch. She pressed her palm flat against the map's surface. Somewhere in the glowing geometry of stars and distances, she touched the point where Earth had been. 94 years, said the man behind her. His name was Director Okan, and he was the oldest human being currently alive at 117, kept functional by medical technology they'd developed in secret. He spoke quietly, as was his habit. The Council has their summit on Thesara Minor in 6 years. That's when the Valori have called the alignment. I know, said Voss. The fleet will be ready. I know that too. She didn't move her hand from the map. They thought silence was surrender, she said. Okan was quiet for a long moment. Let them keep thinking that, he said. For 6 more years. To understand what humanity had built in 100 years of silence, one must first understand what humanity had lost, and then understand, with cold clarity, that grief, when given enough time and enough purpose, does not make a species weaker. It makes them architectural. In the first decade after the massacre, the surviving 400 million humans had done something the Keth's models never predicted. They didn't scatter. They contracted. It was a decision made not by any single government, those were gone, but by a loose constellation of surviving military commanders, scientists, and colony administrators who found each other through tight beam laser communication, a technology so old and so limited in range that the Keth hadn't even bothered to monitor for it. Laser communication traveled at the speed of light. It required precise alignment between sender and receiver. In a galaxy that moved in 3 dimensions, it was, by most galactic standards, laughably primitive, which meant it was completely invisible to the Keth. The first message passed through the network took 11 years to reach all its destinations. Bounced from station to asteroid to distant colony, each node receiving it and passing it on in silence, like a secret whispered through a chain of 1,000 hands. The message was brief. It said, "We are gathering. Coordinates follow. Come dark. Come quiet. Come prepared to wait." The coordinates pointed to a region of space the Galactic Council called the Null Drift, a wide band of densely packed nebula gas and magnetic interference that made long-range sensor sweeps nearly impossible. It was considered strategically valueless. No habitable worlds, no mineable asteroids of significance. No reason for any advanced civilization to spend resources exploring it. It was, in other words, perfect. The station called Cradle was built over 20 years, entirely within the Null Drift, using materials stripped from abandoned colony ships and mined from the interior of a rogue planetoid they'd captured and hollowed out. At its peak population, Cradle housed 11,000 people. It had no external lighting. Its hull was coated in a composite material that absorbed radar, sound, and most scanning frequencies. It maintained communications silence as a religion. Cradle was not the only station. By year 30, there were 9 such installations scattered through the Null Drift and the adjacent quiet zones, each one isolated, each one communicating with the others only through the laser whisper network, each one dedicated to a specific function. Station Cradle, military command and strategic planning. Station Foundry, weapons manufacturing and ship construction. Station Lexicon, intelligence gathering and xenolinguistics, station and amnesis, historical preservation and cultural memory, station Prometheus, scientific research and advanced technology development, and 4 others whose names were never spoken aloud outside their own walls, because their purposes were darker, more patient, and more terrible than the others. The ships they built were unlike anything in the Keth's tactical databases, because the Keth's tactical databases were 40 years out of date by the time humanity began launching them. The first generation had been conventional enough. Retrofitted colony ships repurposed as warships, their cargo bays replaced with weapon systems adapted from salvaged Keth technology. The humans had studied every piece of Keth hardware they could recover. They were methodical about it. Every wrecked Keth ship from the original assault that could be reached was reached, stripped, analyzed, catalogued, understood. But the humans hadn't stopped at understanding. They had improved. By year 50, Station Foundry was producing vessels that bore no resemblance to any ship class in known galactic history. They were built around a design philosophy the engineers called Doctrine of Ghost. Vessels that were simultaneously as destructive as possible and as detectable as nothing. The hull geometry was fractal, designed to scatter sensor pings in 17 different directions simultaneously. The drive systems were completely enclosed within layers of dampening material, producing no heat signature detectable beyond 30,000 kilometers. The weapon systems were built around a technology the human physicists had developed from first principles, one they called the null projector, which did not fire a beam or a projectile or an energy wave but instead collapsed a precise volume of space into a temporary null state, a bubble of absolute zero energy that caused any matter inside it to undergo catastrophic atomic unraveling. The null projector had a range of 200,000 kilometers. The largest Keth dreadnought had hull armor rated to withstand a sustained plasma bombardment at close range for 40 minutes. Against a null projector, hull armor was a philosophical concept with no practical value. But weapons were only part of what grew in the dark. The other part was intelligence. Station Lexicon had spent 100 years doing something so patient, so painstaking, so utterly without drama, that it barely appeared in the stories humans told themselves about their century of silence. Lexicon's people had spent 100 years listening, not transmitting, not responding, just listening. Every transmission the Keth sent through open channels, every diplomatic communication between the Keth Dominion and the Galactic Council, every trade negotiation, every military bulletin, every census report, every internal political argument broadcast over the Keth public communication network, every language, every cipher, every data format the Keth used, understood, catalogued, broken. By year 60, Lexicon could read every Keth military communique in real time. By year 80, Lexicon had assets, people, devices, and in some cases carefully cultivated relationships with other non-Keth species, positioned near every major Keth installation in the galaxy. By year 100, Lexicon knew the location of every Keth military vessel, the rotation schedule of every garrison, the chain of command of every fleet, the political fault lines within the Keth Senate, the name of every Keth admiral who had participated in the original assault on human space and the current coordinates of each one. This information had been compiled into a document. The document had a title. It was called the Ledger. The person who had compiled the ledger was a woman named Commandant Yara Dali, who ran Station Lexicon with the focused intensity of someone who had been born into a specific purpose and had never once been distracted from it. Dali was the daughter of refugees. Her parents had been aboard one of the last colony ships to escape the Sol system, young and terrified and carrying nothing but the genetic material of humanity's future and a portable drive containing the entire Library of Congress, the complete works of every human composer, and a single family photograph taken on a beach on Earth in 2281. The beach no longer existed. Neither did the ocean it had sat beside. Dolly kept a copy of the photograph on her desk. She was not sentimental about it. It was not there to comfort her. It was there to remind her of the arithmetic, of what had been lost and what was owed. She was reviewing the ledger when her communications officer entered with a tight beam message from Admiral Voss at Cradle. 6 years, the message said. Dolly set down the ledger and looked at the photograph. 6 years, she agreed. On the Keth homeworld of Keth Prime, a vast, dry, red-dusted world of canyon cities and orbital megastructures, the political conversation about humanity had reduced itself to an almost ceremonial formality. Once a decade, the Senate's Frontier Affairs Committee published a brief report on the status of residual human populations. The report for year 90 had been 3 paragraphs. The report for year 100 was 2. The second paragraph noted with bureaucratic indifference that deep space sensor sweeps of the former human territories had detected nothing of note. No fleet activity, no construction signatures, no communication signals. The third paragraph recommended formally reclassifying humanity from residual population to extinct or near-extinct species, historical category. The motion passed without debate. The Senate moved on to other business, what no Keth sensor had detected, and what no Keth analyst had thought to look for, was the specific gravitational signature of 312 warships moving in absolute communication silence through the dense nebula of the null drift toward their designated jump coordinates. 312 ships, the largest human fleet ever assembled, crewed by men and women who had been born in secret, raised in the dark, trained for a single purpose, and who had grown up hearing the same 3 words, the last words humanity had spoken to the galaxy before going silent, passed from parent to child, from commander to recruit, from old to young like a torch kept burning in a closed room. We will remember. They remembered. The Galactic Council Summit on Thesera Minor occurred every 50 years, and the one in 2387 was expected to be unremarkable. The Valori had requested it be held on their world this cycle, which was unusual. The Valori rarely sought the spotlight of galactic politics, but not so unusual as to attract significant comment. The agenda included trade route renegotiations in the Lyran Arm, the ongoing territorial dispute between the hegemony and the Garan Collective, and a scheduled ceremonial moment in which humanity would be formally reclassified, and a small memorial would be dedicated, because even the galactic community had its gestures. 41 ambassadors arrived on Thesera Minor over the 3 days preceding the summit's opening session. They came in their finest ships, with their retinues and their political agendas, and they settled into the sweeping architecture of the council hall, which the Valori had built at the bottom of a shallow ocean, its walls made of living coral, its ceiling open to the filtered light of a pale blue sun. The Keth delegation arrived last, as was their custom, a display of precedence that no one protested because no one had ever successfully protested anything the Keth did. High Provost Dan Ethrek led the delegation. He was the political successor to the Keth commanders who had overseen the original assault, and he wore that legacy without shame or apology. He was tall, angular, his gray-plated skin bearing the formal markings of the Dominion's senior military caste. He had never once in 40 years of political life been asked to answer for what his species had done in 2287. He took his seat at the head of the Keth delegation and waited for the summit to begin. The Valori ambassador, an ancient creature named Thesera who persists, moved to the central podium. She said, "Before we begin the formal agenda, there is a matter we must address." Ethrek leaned slightly forward. There was something in the old Valori's voice, a quality he couldn't quite identify. He had heard Thesera who persists speak many times over the decades, and she had always sounded like deep water, patient, unhurried. This was different. She sounded, he realized after a moment, like deep water that was beginning to move. 100 years ago, she said, this council voted to decline intervention following the Keth Dominion's assault on human space. I cast the one dissenting vote. I said at the time that this council was making a catastrophic mistake. Ethrek straightened. Around him, the other Keth delegates shifted. This was not the usual opening. I would like, Thesera who persists said, and now her bioluminescence pulsed in a slow, deep wave across her entire body, to formally amend my earlier statement. She paused. It was not a mistake. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. She stepped back from the podium. The lights in the council hall went out. Not the emergency darkness of a power failure, not the sudden blackout of an attack. The lights went out the way a held breath is released, controlled, deliberate, purposeful. And in the absolute dark of the coral hall at the bottom of the Valori Ocean, the ceiling above the assembled ambassadors lit up. Not with filtered sunlight, with starships. 312 vessels had entered the Thessera Minor system 11 hours ago, moving at minimum drive power, coated in the darkness of their ghost hulls, dropping out of fold space at coordinates so far from the system's sensor perimeter that by the time the automated arrays would have detected them, it would have been too late. It was too late. The ships hung in orbit above the Valori world, each one still running silent, each one dark, but visible now in the bioluminescent display the Valori had woven into the council hall's living ceiling. Not as threats, as a demonstration, as a statement. The hall erupted. 40 ambassadors speaking at once in 37 languages, their translation implants cascading into overlapping chaos, security systems activating. Keth delegates reaching for communication devices that had suddenly, inexplicably stopped functioning. Ethrek stood. He had been a political creature for 40 years, which meant he had learned the skill of projecting calm when what he felt was the opposite of calm. He stood, and he looked at the ceiling and he counted ships with the trained eye of the military caste he'd been born into. He counted to 300. He kept counting. When the lights returned, the woman standing at the central podium was not Tessera who persists. She was human. She was not tall. She was not imposing in the conventional sense. She wore no military regalia beyond a single emblem on the collar of her dark jacket. A small blue circle with a white point of light at its center, which those with knowledge of old Earth cartography might have recognized as a stylized representation of the pale blue dot. The way Earth had looked once from very far away. Admiral Sarah Voss looked at the assembled ambassadors of the Galactic Council, with eyes that had spent 40 years reading star maps in the dark, and she said, in a voice that carried the weight of 100 years of silence, "My name is Sarah Voss. I represent the reconstituted Human Directorate. We are not extinct. We are not residual. We are not surrendered." She let that settle. 100 years ago, 14 billion human beings were murdered in a 6-week campaign authorized and celebrated by the Keth Dominion. This council voted not to intervene. 43-1. Her eyes found the Keth delegation. We have spent 100 years deciding what to do about that. High Provost Ethrek had recovered enough to speak. He had political reflexes as highly tuned as any creature in the galaxy, and those reflexes were already calculating fleet position, escape vectors, the likelihood that those ships in orbit were equipped with weapons capable of. He stood. "You have violated Galactic Council treaty space. This incursion is not an incursion," Voss said calmly. "We have not fired. We have not threatened. We are here, in this hall, speaking, which is the first time a human being has spoken in this chamber in 100 years." She tilted her head slightly. "You should have noticed the quiet earlier. What do you want?" The question came out harder than Ethrek intended. There was something in the woman's stillness that rattled him in a way he hadn't been rattled since he searched his memory, since he was a young military attaché watching archival footage of the quieting pulse, and he'd seen in the final seconds before the recording cut out a human face looking directly at the camera. The face had not been afraid. It had looked somehow like it was recording him. "What do you want?" he asked again, quieter. Voss reached into her jacket and produced a data slate. She set it on the podium. "There is a document on that slate. It is called the Ledger. It contains the names of every Keth military officer who participated in the assault on human space, the assault on our colonies, and the ground campaigns that followed. It contains their current ranks, their current positions, and their current locations." The silence in the hall was absolute. It also contains the coordinates of every Keth military installation in the galaxy, the current deployment status of every Keth fleet, the names of every Keth admiral and their chain of command, the full specifications of Keth weapon systems as they existed 100 years ago, and as we believe them to exist now, and a complete political and economic analysis of the Keth Dominion's internal fault lines. She paused. "We have had a long time to pay attention." Ithrek's political reflexes had gone very quiet. What was operating now was something older. Something that lived beneath the political calculus and the Senate speeches and the 40 years of comfortable impunity. Something that felt, distantly and with great reluctance, like fear. "What?" he said very carefully. "Do you want?" "3 things," Voss said. "First, formal acknowledgement from this council that the events of 2287 constitute genocide, and that the council's vote to decline intervention was a failure of collective moral responsibility." She held up one finger. "Second, the Keth Dominion will provide full territorial reparations, the restoration of all human colony worlds currently under Keth occupation, the complete withdrawal of Keth military presence from the Sol Arm, and 50 years of resource transfers sufficient to rebuild what was destroyed." 2 fingers. "Third, those whose names appear in the ledger under the categories of command authorization and direct execution will be surrendered to an international tribunal for prosecution under the Galactic Convention on Mass Atrocity." 3 fingers. She lowered her hand. "These are not opening positions. These are not negotiating points. These are the terms." Etheric made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "And if we refuse?" Voss looked at him for a long moment. "Then we will demonstrate what 312 ghost-hulled warships equipped with null projectors are capable of," she said, "and you will spend the rest of the Keth Dominion's history wondering how many more there are in the dark." She picked up the data slate and set it down in front of the Keth delegation. "We did not come here to destroy you," she said. "We came here because we are still capable of choosing not to. But that choice has a window, High Provost, and 100 years is long enough to have learned patience." The council hall was silent for 11 seconds. Then the Valori ambassador, Tessara Who Persists, pressed both of her great bioluminescent hands flat against the coral floor of the hall, and her entire body blazed with light, gold and deep green in the cold blue of abyssal water. In the Valori gesture that meant, in their oldest formal language, witnessed and affirmed. One by one across the hall other ambassadors began to move. Not all of them. Not the ones who had voted with the Keth a century before without paying any price. Not immediately, but some of them. And then more. The negotiations lasted 9 days. They were the most watched 9 days in the history of the Galactic Council. Watched by species who had spent a century believing humanity was gone. Watched by young Keth citizens who had never been told the full history of what their dominion had done. Watched by the children and grandchildren of survivors on stations throughout the Null Drift, and the quiet outer reaches where humans had lived in silence for a century. Watched on the 3rd day, when High Provost Etheric received a private communication from the Keth Joint Military Command, a communication that Lexicon had intercepted within 4 minutes of its transmission, informing him that a preliminary analysis of the ships in orbit suggested the humans had not been bluffing about the null projectors. The tests had been inconclusive. But inconclusive, when the alternative was proving them wrong by firing, was as good as confirmed. The Keth Dominion was not fundamentally a suicidal civilization. It was a calculating one. And the calculation, by day 4, had shifted. The formal acknowledgement came on day 6. It was read aloud by the Council's senior archivist, not a Keth, at the insistence of 41 of the 42 other delegations, in a ceremony that was broadcast across every open galactic communication channel. It named 14 billion human beings who had been killed. It named the Keth Dominion as the perpetrator. It named the Council's vote as a moral failure. It was 412 words long. Admiral Voss listened to all 412 words standing perfectly still in the center of the council hall, her hands at her sides, her face composed. When the archivist finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular, "It's not enough." Director Okan, who had come to Thesara Minor for the occasion, and who stood just behind her right shoulder, said equally quietly, "No, it isn't. But it's a start." "Yes," he agreed. "It's a start." The territorial restoration took 11 years to complete, not because of Keth resistance and that window had passed and everyone in the galaxy now knew it, but because of the sheer physical work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Human colony worlds that had been under Keth occupation for a century required environmental remediation, infrastructure reconstruction, and in some cases complete ecological restoration. Earth itself was the hardest. The quieting pulse had done no direct physical damage to the planet's surface. But a century of atmospheric neglect following the destruction of orbital climate management systems had resulted in changes that would take generations to reverse. The oceans had risen. The ice caps had retreated. 17 coastal cities sat beneath shallow water. They rebuilt them anyway. Not in the same places. Not in the same forms. But with the same names. Because names were one of the things that couldn't be taken. The tribunal was a separate and longer process. It ran for 7 years, and it was not without controversy. There were Keth political factions that called it victor's justice, and there were human voices that called it inadequate, and both assessments contained their own truths. The tribunal was imperfect. The law it applied was being written as it was being used. Of the 417 Keth officers listed in the ledger under command authorization and direct execution, 301 were brought before the tribunal. 62 had died of age or other causes in the century of human silence. 54 could not be located, and the official record noted without elaboration that Station Lexicon's intelligence suggested those 54 had not, in fact, all died of natural causes. The note in the official record was never formally disputed. On the 11th anniversary of the Thessera Minor Summit, a ceremony was held on the surface of Earth. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no orbital light shows, no fleet demonstrations, no political speeches broadcast across galactic channels. It was attended by approximately 4,000 people, most of them the oldest living humans, those who had been children on the colony ships, who carried the physical memory of before. A monument had been built at the site of what had once been a city on the eastern coast of a continent called North America. The city had been called New York. The monument was simple. A column of black stone, 200 meters tall, engraved from base to summit with names. 14 billion names. It had taken 40 years to engrave them all. At the base of the column, a single line in the English language, the tongue that humanity had last spoken before going silent. We will remember, and we did. Admiral Sarah Voss stood before the monument on the day of the ceremony and did something she had not done in 40 years of military command. She cried, not for long, not in a way that her officers saw clearly, though they all looked elsewhere, with the careful tact of people who understood that some moments are private even when they happen in public. She cried because she could finally afford to, because for 100 years grief had been a weapon, carefully contained, precisely directed, transformed into something useful, into plans and training and weapons research and intelligence networks, and the slow, patient architecture of vengeance that had been built in the dark. Now the dark was over. Now there was room for grief that was just grief, without a purpose attached to it. She let herself have it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she straightened, turned to face her officers and said, "We have work to do." Director Okan, who was 128 years old by this point, and who had been kept alive by medical technology that surprised even him, had spent the years since Thessera Minor doing something unexpected. He had started teaching. Not military history, not strategy, not the technical details of how humanity had built its ghost fleet in the dark. He taught the history of Earth. The small history, not the politics and the wars and the civilizational turning points, but the ordinary history. The food and the music and the games children had played and the jokes people had told, and the books that had been written about nothing in particular, just the feeling of being alive. He taught this to the children who had been born after Thessera Minor, who were growing up on a planet being rebuilt, who would never know Earth the way their great-grandparents had known it, but who might, if the teaching was good enough, know something essential about what they came from. One of his students, a girl of about 10, born on Earth itself in one of the new coastal cities, asked him once, "Why were you quiet for so long? Why didn't you just fight back right away?" Okan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because fighting back right away would have been fighting from anger," he said, "and anger burns hot and fast and then it's gone. What did you fight from instead?" "Something colder," he said, "something that doesn't run out." She thought about this. "What do you call that?" Okan looked out the window at the pale blue sky above a rebuilt city on a healing world, and he thought of a photograph on a desk on a station in the dark, and a wall of light covered in star maps, and a woman's voice saying 3 words into a silent galaxy. "We call it memory," he said. In the deep archives of station lexicon, which had been decommissioned as a military installation but preserved as a historical site, the original recording of humanity's last transmission was kept in a climate-controlled vault. It was played once, on the anniversary of the massacre. Just played, not broadcast, not performed, not narrated. Just a voice in a recording saying 3 words. The voice belonged to Commander Eleanor Roth, who had been the last human officer at the last operational communication array when the Keth closed in. She had been 31 years old. She had known, when she transmitted those words, that she had minutes left. She had used them well. "We will remember." The recording lasted 4 seconds. The silence after it lasted as long as the listener needed. 300 years after the massacre, a young Keth historian named Sarath published a paper that caused significant controversy within the Keth Academic Council. The paper was titled, "The Strategic Miscalculation of 2287, How the Keth Dominion Created the Conditions for Its Own Strategic Defeat, by Underestimating Human Resilience and Misreading Silence as Submission." It was 11,000 words long and rigorously sourced. Its conclusion was a single paragraph. The Keth Dominion's fundamental error was not tactical, not strategic, and not technological. It was philosophical. We believed that a species which had lost the capacity to speak had lost the will to act. We did not understand, and this failure of understanding nearly proved catastrophic, that silence is not the absence of power. In humans, silence was power in its most concentrated form, restrained, directed, and waiting. We mistook the held breath for the last breath. We would have been wiser to know the difference. The paper was widely read, widely taught, and in the margins of more than one copy, in the handwriting of readers both Keth and human and from a dozen other species across the galaxy, someone had written the same 4 words. They always came back.